Thank you for the warm introduction. It's a real honor to be back in Seoul for the second Asia-Pacific conference. We had a very interesting experience last year, and to be back again is a real honor. We're very grateful to all of our sponsors and supporters for joining us again this year for the second event. We see the importance of air quality and technology progress is very important in Korea, and it's very encouraging to have companies that are prepared to commit to developing this technology and improve the environment. Coming to this event is always like seeing some old friends. So some of you I've been meeting in different parts of the world for 10 years, perhaps, and even more sometimes. So it's a real honor to see you again, and we hope to have a really constructive few days of discussion at the conference. The purpose of my opening address is to set the scene for this 2 days of conference. So I'm hoping to give you raise some issues which I think are relevant for our discussions in the next 2 days, perhaps frame a few issues and challenges which we face, which could help during the course of our discussions and during the course of follow-on presentations to make sure we do tackle those issues and explore how we can solve some of those things that are coming up towards us as an industry and a group who are dedicated to transforming diesel engines and clean vehicles for the future. My agenda today is to give an outlook to the truck and bus market. I'll be looking for, in particular, at the situation in Asia and in Korea. Then give a summary of where the emissions regulations are in the region, make some comments on some technology issues which have arisen, and then link that to a forecast of the use of some of these after-treatment technologies. So let's start with the truck and bus market. This is just a summary of truck and bus sales in 2016, a year that's just finished if you are tracking markets like we do. We work with other companies in the industry. In particular, we work with LMC for the world truck analysis and ACT in the US. So this is some combined work we've done together. But to summarize, the truck industry saw sales up by about 3% in 2016 overall. So it was a relatively stable year. But if you dive into the details, you see the range of developments around the globe were very divergent. We had some very tough market conditions in some parts of the world and some very strong conditions in other parts. In the US, we had a very tough market for the truck business. We saw truck sales contract by 8% in North America in 2016. Some very tough situations there for the truck manufacturers who had to suspend production and had difficult times in terms of reducing their order numbers and their production levels. We'll talk about the future in the next slide, but just looking back, that was a decline, and certainly the US truck market was in a worrying situation. In Latin America, the difficulty there is Brazil. You're very familiar, I guess, with the economic situation in Brazil, which has almost come to a complete standstill in many senses, and the truck sales have basically dropped to a very small share of what they were before. So South America overall was down, driven mostly last year by very slow sales in Brazil. The third region in the red in 2016 was Russia, where we had a decline in sales. Of course, it's a smaller truck market, but the lower oil price, sanctions in Russia, some of the other political developments in Russia saw the truck industry declining by about 4% in 2016. On the plus side, the EU truck market grew by about 8%. This was a big part of this was a bounce back in some very slow markets which had seen very slow sales earlier. So some renewed vigor in countries like Spain, France and the UK. So 8% up in the EU, but that came on the back of some very slow years. So this is a level of sales which is below where we've seen the peak of sales in the past. But the real positive region globally in 2016 was Asia, and there you can see China alone. We saw truck sales of 831,000 units, 10% up on the year before, which was a fairly slow year. And then Asia outside of China up 9%, including Korea, where we had good increases in sales. So really the message is the positive growth in truck sales globally was in Asia in the last year just finished. So what about the future then? Where do we look when we look ahead? This is just so you have the numbers by region. But you can see here that the share of truck sales and overall truck sales are forecast to increase by us from about 2.6 million units in last year, which I just showed you, up to about 3.1 million units in 2022. So that's a growth of about half a million trucks over the 6-year period. Going back, if we just dissect those numbers a little bit, let's start with where there's most uncertainty. I'll say, in terms of the global situation for economic outlook, the uncertainties currently are really in, I guess you'd have to say, in the US and in Europe, where we've got some unexpected political situations. Starting with the US, where, of course, the Trump administration has come in the last couple of months and has made some very bold plans to invest in infrastructure. So from expecting the truck market to be pretty slow, which is when this forecast was, we do this forecast quarterly, so if you can see those numbers, we were expecting a slight decline in truck sales in the US and Canada in 2017, even slightly lower than 2016. What we've actually had in the US is we've had a bump up in sales. So Class 8s, which is the biggest size of trucks, Class 8s are the big tractors mostly. We've seen an increase in truck sales. January and February and March sales were really strong in the US. If you look into the details of how that's been explained, what we find is a lot of those truck buyers have been small fleets, owner-operator fleets. Owner-operators are a very important segment in the US. Lots of drivers own their own trucks or own one or two or three trucks, and those drivers have seen the Trump administration's plans as being very optimistic, very positive for their future. So a lot of trucks have been sold to owner-operators in the last 3 months who only change their trucks sometimes every 15 or 20 years. So they're looking at the positive trend on their business. It also happens to be quite a good time to be buying trucks if you don't change your truck very often, because the current technology makeup of trucks in the US is quite stable and mature. The technology is reliable. There was a period of quite unreliable trucks in the 27 to 10 time frame. And in the future, we have some potentially unreliable technology coming with future greenhouse gas. So now's a good time to buy, and owner-operators have bought. The thing is, it hasn't really been expected, and big truck fleets not so keen. So given the uncertainty of what will happen with the Trump administration in the future and how much those plans will actually be implemented. So we're holding a conservative view for the US. We'll see how it turns out. This year is going to be very interesting, of course, in terms of how Trump and his administration succeed in getting laws through Congress. They've had trouble with recent laws like the healthcare bill. So we're predicting moderate growth in the US truck industry, but there's a lot of uncertainty there. It could be quite tough. Long-term growth in the US could be hit by reducing exports because of the Trump administration's approach to trade. Lots of uncertainty. So on balance, we're predicting about a 10% increase over 5 years, but it could be up or down on that level. But let's move on from the US. In Europe, the main uncertainty is political. So you've got Brexit, which is where I live. Britain is leaving the EU, and that's caused some question marks around Europe about other countries who might potentially vote to do the same. There's some elections coming up that could throw up that issue. There could be more division in Europe. Again, that's uncertainty, and we're not predicting a great deal of increase in truck sales in Europe. Pretty flat if you look at the forecasts. So those are the two regions where there's uncertainty. Looking to where we're seeing or forecasting growth coming up, we're predicting a fairly strong growth in truck sales in China. So about 950,000 trucks and buses sold, if you include all categories, medium and heavy duty, in China in 2016. So we're seeing that grow to more than 1 million, perhaps even 1.1 to 1.2 million units of truck sales by 2022. There's some underlying factors that are pushing truck sales in China. One of the recent developments has been a crackdown on overloading of trucks that you may have heard of. So the truck load has been, in many categories, has been limited to 49 tons, I think it is, where it used to be 55 tons. So that alone is quite an increase in truck demand. Drivers are being pulled over and fined, and it's having an effect on the demand for trucks itself. Quite a surge in truck demand in the fourth quarter last year, linked to that. It's also had some unexpected consequences, like LNG vehicles have got quite heavy fuel tanks, and those have been affected by the total gross vehicle weight, the policing of the gross vehicle weight. So in the short term, that's quite a driver of, I think, truck demand. It could see truck purchasing increase in 2017, perhaps beyond the level we have in the charts. But longer term, we think there might be some moderation on government stimulus in China. Might not be as aggressive growth as we've seen in the last 5 years, but we do think we'll in the next 5 years we'll reach the 1.2 million truck sales region. So China is a third of global truck sales in most years, and certainly we expect that to continue in the next 5 years. In India, we're expecting the last 5 years trend, which has been quite stable growth, 4 or 5% growth in truck sales every year, to continue. So we're forecasting about 250,000 truck sales last year to go up to about 320 in 2022. So that's probably one of the most ambitious growth rates in our whole forecast. Really steady growth in India, driven by economic growth, increasing trade intensity, industrial development policy by Modi, lots of positive factors there. But then turning to Asia Pacific, which is where we put Korea. Asia Pacific for us is Korea, Japan, and some other countries. Korea is about 1/3 of that Asia Pacific number, with truck sales 2016 were about 40,000 units, if I remember. So that region is forecast to grow quite rapidly, from about 130,000 units last year to about 170, 180 in 2022. A big share of that driven by growth in Korea, which I'll talk about in a minute. But below that line on my table, we see the rest being quite flat. We see a bounce back in Russia. If you see oil prices going up and some more openness between Russia and the US, there could be increased trade. So also the truck sales in Russia have been at a very low base, below replacement levels. So we see some growth there. But outside of that, Turkey and Brazil flat, rest of the world quite flat. So we're not so sure of strong trends outside of those, outside of the key regions I've mentioned at the start. So really the growth driven by India, China, Asia Pacific. So you can see that in terms of graphically. You can see, let's go back. Europe and the US and China together are about 2/3 of truck sales. If you add in India, we're closer to 80% of truck sales. The first 4 bars are EU, North America, China, India. We then have Russia. This is the Asia-Pacific region, which includes Korea, and you can see there the dark blue segment growing quite strongly in that outlook period, showing one of the strongest growth rates of all the regions, and then relatively stable growth in Brazil, Turkey, and rest of the world. As always, the China questions, the China is a big share of the market, so any small change in China has a big effect on the overall numbers. But we certainly do believe that the potential is there for China growth to continue at the levels we've seen in the last few years. What about Korea? Well, the market here is quite interesting, and this won't be news to many of you, but for those of you not that familiar with the Korean market, this is the 2016 numbers, provisional numbers we have. And you can see that on the heavy and medium-duty truck side of things, Hyundai is really dominant, about 74% market share there of sales. 2016 sales of medium and heavy-duty trucks, about 30,000 units. So a strong growth that we've seen in that sector compared to 2013. Only 3 years earlier, we had 20,000 truck sales, medium and heavy duty. So there's a 50% growth in 3 years. And that's at a time when we saw the introduction of Euro 6. So some very big technical changes. So the market here is buoyant, certainly very strong. The second player in the truck sector is Tata Daewoo, about 26% of sales, 25% of sales of that segment. And then growing from a very small base, but certainly a new element in the last year or two has been the entry of companies like Volvo, importers like Volvo, MAN, and Daimler Trucks, who are selling their European truck designs in Korea and growing quite quickly, but as I said, from a very small base, and are expected to grow their market share steadily in the years ahead. On the bus side of things, the bus market's a bigger share of total vehicle sales in Korea than it is in many other countries. About a quarter of total vehicle sales are buses and coaches in Korea, whereas globally it's more like 6 or 8% in most countries. So this is a big share. 11,000 sold in 2016. 66% of those are Hyundai and its group, so a big shares similar to the truck market shares. Zaya Daewoo Bus is 20%, and Kia Motors has about 13%. So there's more of a share between the three suppliers in the bus market. Looking forward, what does it mean for the future? Well, when we looked at the forecast, we've been looking mostly on our projects in Korea at diesel vehicles. So this is a forecast of diesel commercial vehicle sales. We've taken out non-diesel buses. About 15% of sales are non-diesel, especially CNG buses. And the government's quite committed to increasing that share, even converting that to hydrogen fuel cell buses. So we've actually forecast the share of bus sales the share of diesel in bus sales to decline from the current 85% to perhaps 80 or less percent. But overall, of course, dominated by trucks. And so we see the growth going from about 40,000 units of commercial vehicle sales last year to about 64,000 units in 2022. So that growth rate of between 5 and 10,000 units per year increase, we expect this to be sustained by continued economic growth in Korea, strong government policy towards road transport, and investment in replacement of older vehicles, which is driven by the environmental profile of those older vehicles. So moving on to my second major topic, emissions regulations. We're going to discuss this in some detail today, and experts will be sharing their view of the Korean regulations and some of the exciting things coming up in the future. So I'll give a quick review of some of the key things we've seen in the region. I think a regional issue is quite well summarized in this very well-known chart from Cummins. But what Cummins have added here is the sulfur in fuel. And of course, as we get down into that tight little box in the corner we're very familiar with, the NOx PM limits for the Euro 6 equivalents or the EPA 2010 equivalent regulations. One of the requirements for that level of emissions control is low sulfur diesel. And we've seen countries like India in particular, but also China and other countries in Asia have been limited on their implementation of regulation because of the lack of infrastructure for low sulfur diesel. It's really held back progress in many countries and meant really bad implications for air quality. But in Korea, we've seen a very vibrant, supporting infrastructure, and low sulfur diesel is widely available, has been widely available for some time. And so we saw Korea move to advanced regulation early. And I think it's a credit to the industry and the governments and the stakeholders that the implementation of regulation in Korea has been so well managed. Globally, of course, regulations are very diverse, and this is one graphical way of showing that. But at the top, we show the triad, sometimes called the triad, which is the countries that have the most advanced regulations, which would be North America, EU, and Japan. And you can see that at the current date, in 2017, the green bars represent a roughly Euro 6 or EPA 10 equivalent regulation. So you can see in those regions, we quite fell far into the implementation of those Euro 6 levels. And in fact, we're already at the second or third phase in some cases of supplementary regulation like OBD. But the interesting thing is that Korea is in equivalently an advanced position. Japan is at the post-new long-term regulation, actually, but Korea is already at the Euro 6 level. And not many other countries in the world are quite that advanced. If you move down this graphic, you see many countries are currently at Euro 5 or even Euro 4. And some of those developments have been slowed down, as I mentioned, by the sulfur and the diesel, the lack of low sulfur diesel. Something that I wanted to add was just the climate change aspect, because probably in the last 5 years predominantly we've seen climate change become much more of a driving factor. In the past, we only used to discuss the left side of this, which was air quality was bad, so we needed emission standards, which meant new technologies, which reduced these species and improved public health. But of course, the focus moved to climate change in different regions quite rapidly. And we see, for a different reason, we see the driver of climate change impacting on fuel economy standards, greenhouse gas emission standards, having an impact on technologies, and the interaction there is quite complex. What's important to say is this has been a one-way movement, I would say, in most cases. Like Japan was the first country to have fuel economy standards in 2005, and other countries have followed, the US most prominently, but also China. But more recently in the US, with the Trump administration's approach to greenhouse gas, I think we see the first time when we might see a clawback on those regulations and a reversal of that direction of movement, certainly. Trump has been very clear that he doesn't support climate change regulation. And so there's an open debate about what that'll mean for the truck industry, because we've just finished the implementation in the US of what's called Phase 1 greenhouse gas regulations, which are the strictest globally currently, and those required a fairly substantial reduction in about 20% roughly emissions of CO2 and a reduction in fuel economy. But looking ahead, there's already a rule published in the last few weeks of Obama's administration which defined Phase 2 being implemented from 2018 to 2027. Now, what will happen to that regulation? I've been in many meetings in the last month, including in the US, and I think the balance of opinion is that that regulation has gone too far to be unwound. I think it probably will go ahead, but it is going to reduce the pressure in the US on further actions towards reducing CO2 from trucks. And I think there's some ill-defined regulations like the ultra-low NOx rule, which is a related regulation, which probably won't go ahead under Trump's administration. So this used to be a one-way direction, one-way path of movement, to summarize. But I think the politics in North America mean that we're perhaps entering an era where this will be more open for debate. But certainly in Asia, the commitment seems to be quite strong from governments towards increasing the regulation of fuel economy and greenhouse gas. A quick skip through the regulations, just to give you a high-level summary to lay the context for today. Japan has a 0.4 NOx limit, a 0.4 grams per brake horsepower, in line with Euro 4, similar PM limits. As I mentioned, Japan also has Japan was the first country to introduce SCR technology and advanced after treatment. 2004, I think, was when Nissan launched the first SCR truck in Japan. Also the first country to have the CO2 regulation based on the top runner approaches, which is like a benchmark, a test of all the competitors, and the top runner is the best performer. It becomes the standard. So that was one of the first approaches we saw for CO2. But Japan is now in the area of post new long-term regulations, where the NOx limits are in line roughly with Euro 6. In China, I've discussed China to some extent already, but to summarize, we currently have the introduction of China 5 emission standards in 2017. That's been delayed. China 4 and China 5 were delayed at different points because of the low sulfur fuel availability. But we did see China 5 come in areas with particularly bad air quality like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangdong. And so it was a pragmatic approach to try and improve air quality where the issues were the most severe. There's some discussion of China 6 coming up in the early 2020s. The one interesting difference with China 5 compared to Europe is that China 5 uses the world harmonized test cycle, so a new test cycle which was only introduced in Europe for Euro 6. So it's a stricter test cycle that has more driving conditions in low speed, low load, a tougher test cycle to meet, especially for city driving. So it goes some way towards addressing the concerns of the fact that Euro 5 wasn't very good for urban NOx because of the high emissions of NOx during city driving. China has also been one of the first to introduce CO2 and fuel economy limits before Europe, for example. And the stage 2 fuel economy limits have already been introduced in 2015. Not too stretching in the sense that they didn't change too many technologies. It was more a common approach by the industry. But we now see stage 3 fuel economy and CO2 being introduced, being phased in July 2019 for new types, and then later on for existing types. But that's going to see fuel consumption reduced by about 15% in 2020 compared to the first phase, 2015. So that increase, that improvements in fuel efficiency is roughly in line with what phase 2 in the US is expecting. that 15 to 20% improvement. So quite a stretching standard in China. China increasingly seeing itself as taking a lead ahead of the US in terms of the regulation of climate change in particular and technology for climate change adaptation. In India is probably the most interesting region for recent changes in fuel efficiency. If you haven't followed India, it's quite fascinating. We've got a combination at the moment of Euro 3 nationwide and Euro 4 in the 14 major cities. But just about 6 months ago, the Indian government announced that there would be Euro 6 equivalent standards coming in April 2020. So that's interesting because it means the nationwide regulation jumps from Euro 4 to Euro 6, completely misses Euro 5. That's happened before. In Brazil, we saw a skipping of Euro 4. Brazil went from Euro 3 to Euro 5 equivalent, but that was for a different reason. That was because the fuel economy, the fuel, sulfur fuel wasn't available. This is India kind of catching up, leapfrogging, catching up, getting ahead. So we'll see, if this plan is implemented, we'll see Euro 6 coming in India in 2020, which will be quite some development. That technology is much more advanced than anything in place in India at the moment, and the OBD and all the other related regulations make that quite a tough challenge. Of course, that needs low sulfur fuel, so there's a sequence of like a roadmap of introducing low sulfur fuel in India, starting with 50 ppm fuel by April this month, in fact, and then a sequential deadline of 15 and then 10 ppm fuel by 2020 and 2024. So it seems like the government's finally doing the things that are needed to bring together a regulation that could possibly work at the Euro 6 level. We wait and see if that happens in practice. Of course, the challenges in India are severe in terms of environment and driving conditions and customer ability to pay for trucks and advanced technology. But certainly the intention is quite strong, and this seems to be the boldest move we've seen in India so far. Right. Korea, the situation is simpler, but I won't spend too much time because we have experts speaking today. But across all vehicle categories, we had a really important year. 2014-15 was the introduction of Euro 6 for heavy duty, and Korea's taken the lead in some ways in implementing these technologies. I must say a strong support from the industry, from Hyundai, Tata Daewoo, and from the component suppliers. We'll hear more of that from speakers during the course of the next 2 days, but certainly a strong position in terms of leading emissions control regulation. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to spend too long on technology, and also because many speakers today are talking about technology. I think just 3 points to make, 4 points to make. The first is the technology approach for Euro 6 regulations is now quite mature. This is a Volvo configuration. We're all very familiar with what most companies are doing to meet Euro 6 and the requirements of Euro 6. I think the important points to make, just as observations, are that the increasing focus on CO2 and fuel economy has made this configuration bedded in this configuration in the sense that SCR technology allows for higher engine out NOx under normal driving conditions, especially highway driving conditions where fuel is burned. And so we've seen a move towards high NOx engine calibrations and combustion optimization, which has gone alongside increasing efficiency of the SCR system. This has been particularly clear in US Phase 1 greenhouse gas regulations. We've seen the use of SCR more than double from 2010 to 2016 in terms of its NOx removal potential. And that's meant a big saving on fuel economy, and a big share of the engine contribution to fuel economy savings in the US has been attributed to the increasing use of SCR. That means less EGR, of course, and that's interesting globally. I think that'll be a trend that we see reflected in other regions too. Real driving emissions, our chairman referred to the diesel scandal, the VW scandal in September of 2015. That's had a massive impact on the industry, no doubt, and it's really put the politicians on watch to see what real driving emissions are, especially in conditions where these systems don't work very well. So low driving speeds, low loads, on commercial vehicles particularly. I think that's an increasing focus, and most regions and most countries are looking at PEMs or real driving emissions measures to make sure they capture those conditions. It means much more focus on local conditions, of course, because driving and vehicle types are different in different countries, so there needs to be a tailored approach, but there's no doubt that's not going away. Real driving emissions are certainly a factor. I think the real driving emissions regulation might even come a bit late for light-duty vehicles in Europe. We're seeing so much kickback against diesel cars in Europe, despite the fact that RDE comes in, Euro 6 Part C comes in next year, which is going to the most part, address real driving emissions regulation issues. The market, the social milieu, the feel that politicians have towards cars has moved a long way against diesel. And I wonder if diesel is going to keep that half market share in Europe. I think it might be accelerating the move towards electrification of cars. But that's cars. I think on trucks, PEMS came in early enough, and manufacturers have moved quite quickly to address real driving emission issues. So I think the issue is quite different and much more positive for diesel on the heavy duty. And then a final point here is defeat devices. We have a project on at the moment with the SEER. We're involved in this issue of defeat devices in Europe, which are increasingly prevalent. And you have to say that if defeat devices become common, the whole enterprise, everything we're doing here today and everything all your companies do to clean up vehicles is wasted. And it's a very frustrating development. But the nature of software and the nature of technology is that this stuff is more and more available. And I think it's going to take much more commitment from regulators and governments and OEMs to tackle this, because the growth has been quite substantial. In Brazil, we've seen the enforcement agencies take action and stop vehicles and check to see if they have these overrides installed. The problem is, of course, it's an arms race, and they get more and more sophisticated and harder to find. So this is something that has to be tackled as one of the most important priorities. I know we've seen some of this happening here in Korea, and I know many of you have been involved in looking at what to do against that. I think a key element is education, and that's certainly one of the drives in Europe at the moment, is to make operators aware that if they use these devices, then the environmental impact is very severe. You have trucks, of course, emitting NOx many, many levels higher than even trucks were 15 years ago. So this awareness perhaps isn't there yet, and it needs to be tackled. Finally, just as I wrap up, in our work with our customers, which are OEMs, component suppliers, AdBlue suppliers, we combine all this together, the regulation, the technology choices, the vehicle forecasts. So just looking globally, what does it mean if we take SCR as a measure of the use of after-treatment? It's the most expensive component in the after-treatment system, so we track that quite closely. This is just trucks and buses. You can see here, this is the global, our forecast of the global sales of trucks and buses with SCR systems installed in the next 5 years. About 1.4 million of those vehicles were sold in 2016. The biggest share of those were in the US and Canada. Next was EU. The next was China. But looking forward, we're expecting that to almost double to 2.7 million units of trucks and buses sold, medium and heavy duty trucks and buses sold with SCR technology installed. That's a huge growth rate, almost doubling the market size, mostly because of new regulation coming in China, but also because of growth of truck markets generally. If you translate that into the population of vehicles that are running SCR systems, which is important to our customers that are selling AdBlue or diesel exhaust fluid globally, you'll see there that population of vehicles is going to almost triple from about 7 million vehicles globally, most in the US and Europe currently, to about 18 million vehicles, with the most share being in China in 2022. So China there is the real growth curve, and that has implications, of course, for suppliers of diesel exhaust fluid. You can see a big growth there in Asia Pacific, including Korea. So a strong growth for companies that are marketing that product here in this country. That's all I have time for. I hope that gives you sets the scene. I've tried to tackle a few different issues that I think are important for us to focus on during the next 2 days. So thank you for your attention. I'd be very glad to speak to you and answer any questions. Thank you.